During World War II, a handful of men rose like titans on the battlefield. These German leaders defied the odds, devised bold strategies, and left an indelible legacy in military history. For Adolf Hitler, these men were more than mere commanders. They were the architects of his vision, the swords that sought to expand his empire. From the early days of the conflict, Adolf Hitler realized the importance of surrounding himself with the best military strategists available. Aware of this, the Führer carefully chose a select group of generals to lead the German armed forces. But among them, a question arises that has intrigued historians and enthusiasts for generations. Who was the best German general of World War II? Hassoon Von Manel, the panzer commander of the Großdeutschland. Shortly before the outbreak of World War II, on February 1, 1939, Hassoon Von Manel was appointed as a professor at the School II of Armored Troops in Berlin-Krampnitz, where he remained until 1941. Due to this position, Manteufel did not participate in the early campaigns of the Wehrmacht, such as the invasion of Poland in 1939 and the invasion of France in 1940. On May 1, 1941, Hassoon Von Manel was appointed to take command of the I Battalion of the 7th Rifle Regiment of the 7th Panzer Division. Under these orders, he participated in Operation Barbarossa in 1941, serving under General Herman Hoth, who led the 3rd Panzer Group. During this time, his direct superior was killed in combat, leading von Manteufel to take over the leadership of the 6th Rifle Regiment of the 7th Panzer Division. In May 1942, after the intense Battle of Moscow during the winter of 1941 to 1942, the 7th Panzer Division was sent to France for reorganization. During this period, on July 15, 1942, while the division was recovering in occupied France, Hassoon Von Manteufel was promoted to the position of Chief Commander of the 7th Grenadier Brigade of the same division. In early 1943, Von Manteufel was transferred to North Africa, where he assumed command of the Von Manteufel Division, part of the V Panzer Army, under the command of Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. Manteufel played a prominent role in defensive operations during the Tunisian campaign, effectively leading counterattacks that halted British advances. However, on March 31st, he suffered severe exhaustion and was evacuated to Germany for recovery. Despite his condition, on May 1, 1943, while still in the process of recovery, he was promoted to Major General in recognition of his services in Africa. Once recovered from his wounds on August 22, 1943, Hassoon Von Manteufel was appointed the new commander of the 7th Panzer Division, returning to the Eastern Front, which at that time was experiencing an unfavorable military situation for the Third Reich. The Battle of Kursk and the continuous counterattacks of the Red Army had weakened the morale of the German forces. Despite suffering a back wound from a Russian plane attack on August 26, 1943, Von Manteufel remained in his position, leading the fight in Ukraine. After fierce fighting in Kharkov, Belgorod, and near the Dnieper River, he managed to halt the advance of the Red Army. In November, he managed to capture Zhytomyr, thereby saving the 8th Panzer Division from encirclement north of the city. This success led to his appointment as commander of the elite division of German armored grenadiers, the Großdeutschland, on February 1, 1944. Under his leadership, the division faced a series of defensive battles west of Kirovohrad, but had to reorganize in Romania at the end of March 1944. Then they participated in defensive operations north of Romania until June, when his unit was withdrawn from the front to be kept in reserve until the end of July. At that time, von Manteufel received orders to move to East Prussia to confront the advance of the Red Army. His counterattack in Lithuania, though costly, managed to stabilize the front, but he could not prevent the defeat of Army Group North, which was isolated in Kurland after the defeat suffered by Army Group Center. On September 1, 1944, von Manteufel was promoted to General of Armored Troops and took command of the V Panzer Army on the Western Front of Europe. During the Battle of the Bulge, his unit, the 5th Panzer Army, managed to penetrate deeply into Allied lines, especially in the Battle of Bastogne. On March 10, 1945, von Manteufel became commander of the 3rd Panzer Army on the Eastern Front, with the mission to defend the banks of the Oder River north of Seelow Heights, to protect Berlin from the advance of the Red Army. However, the pressure from General Konstantin Rokossovsky led to the complete crushing of the Wehrmacht during the Battle of Berlin. But faced with the threat of being captured by the Red Army, von Manteuffel chose to surrender to the Western Allies. On April 25, 1945, the Second Belarusian Front broke through the lines of the 3rd Panzer Army near Szczecin. Manteuffel then decided to retreat to Mecklenburg, where his troops finally surrendered to the Western Allies on May 3, 1945, thus avoiding becoming Soviet prisoners of war. Despite Hitler's distrust of von Manteuffel, he valued his military achievements and his ability to effectively lead his troops in difficult situations. This ambivalence was reflected in Hitler's decisions to assign von Manteuffel to leadership positions and his eventual promotion to General of Armored Troops. After Germany's defeat, von Manteuffel was captured by the Allied forces and spent several years in captivity before being released in 1948. He retired to his home in Germany, where he lived in relative anonymity until his death in 1978. Gunther von Kuger, the steel will of the German command. During the Polish campaign of 1939, and as the commander of the 4th German Army, Gunther von Kuger was assigned to Army Group North under the command of Fedor von Bock. During the invasion, Kluger's 4th Army was tasked with advancing from western Pomerania eastward, aiming to join the 3rd Army and secure the Polish corridor. From the first day of the campaign, the 4th Army made significant advances, capturing the port city of Danzig. Kuger demonstrated his tactical skill by successfully coordinating the advance of his forces and overcoming Polish defenses at the Brda River. Subsequently, for trapping Polish forces in the early stages of the invasion, Kuger received praise from Hitler as one of his most brilliant commanders. During the invasion of France in 1940, Kuger led the 4th German Army. Under his leadership, German troops made rapid advances through the Ardennes and the Meuse River, capturing thousands of French prisoners. Despite facing Allied counterattacks, Kuger significantly contributed to the success of the campaign, earning him a promotion to Generalfeldmarschall, Field Marshal. At the opening of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, as part of Army Group Center, Kuger remained in command of the 4th German Army, which faced logistical and disciplinary challenges. In September 1941, he issued an order to restore discipline among his troops and stop unjustified methods of obtaining supplies and abusing the civilian population. During Operation Typhoon, Kuger had the 4th Panzer Group subordinated to the 4th Army, but he faced friction with its commander, Erich Hoepner, over strategy and fuel shortages. Despite advances, German forces failed to reach Moscow due to tenacious Soviet resistance, lack of supplies, and pressure from the German High Command. Kuger eventually compromised his weaker southern flank to attack on December 1, 1941, but this could not prevent the German failure to reach Moscow. By December 18th, Kuger was placed in command of Army Group Center, and during 1942 and early 1943, Kuger's forces were involved in positional warfare around the Rzhev salient, defending against Soviet offensives. In early 1943, Kuger obtained authorization to withdraw some of his forces from the salient. By March 13, 1943, Hitler authorized several offensives, including one against the Kursk salient. However, Kuger refused to launch an immediate attack due to the weakness of his forces. Operation Citadel, which led to the Battle of Kursk, finally began in July 1943. But it failed from the outset due to fierce Soviet resistance, and Kuger was severely injured in a car accident in October 1943, preventing him from returning to service until July 1944, when he was replaced by Field Marshal Ernst Busch. In July 1944, Kuger was appointed commander of the German army in the West. With the Allies taking the initiative, Kuger attempted to establish his authority over Rommel, in charge of Army Group B, and gain the trust of his command in the defense of Normandy. However, by June, the Allies had expelled the Germans from the heights of Saint-Lô, setting the stage for a major offensive called Operation Cobra, launched on July 25th, which broke through German lines and disorganized their resistance. Kuger sent reinforcements to prevent a total collapse, but his forces suffered heavy losses in men and tanks. By early August, the German army in Normandy was weakened, and Kuger could no longer maintain a viable defensive position. Despite his advice to retreat, Hitler ordered a counterattack, Operation Lüttich, between Mortain and Avranches. Kuger knew this would lead to the collapse of the front in Normandy, but his warnings were ignored and the counterattack failed. The Allies launched Operation Tractable on August 14th, aiming to encircle and destroy German forces near Falaise. Under Allied pressure, Kuger issued a massive retreat eastward on August 16th. Hitler initially had confidence in Kuger, who was an experienced and respected commander within the German army. However, this confidence was affected by events related to the July 20th assassination attempt and the circumstances surrounding the damage to Kuger's car in an Allied bombing. These events led Hitler to suspect Kuger's loyalty and eventually to his dismissal. Before these incidents, Kuger was considered a competent and capable commander within the German army. Gunther von Kuger committed suicide on August 19, 1944, using potassium cyanide. It is believed that he chose this action because he was convinced that he had been implicated in the July 20th plot against Hitler. Albert Kesselring, the tactical genius of the Luftwaffe. As the German armed forces unleashed a devastating offensive against Poland in September 1939, with the rank of General der Flieger and as commander of Luftflotte 1, 1st Air Fleet, Albert Kesselring played a pivotal role in coordinating German air forces during the invasion of Poland. His ability to integrate aerial attacks with ground operations proved crucial in the German army's advance. Recognizing air power as a decisive tool, Kesselring employed aviation not only to strike strategic targets, but also to provide direct support to troops on the ground. During the Battle of France in 1940, Albert Kesselring, now as commander of the Luftwaffe's 2nd Air Fleet, played a crucial role in providing close air support to German ground forces and ensuring air superiority over the battlefield. Kesselring also oversaw the air campaign against British forces during the evacuation of Dunkirk, where his ability to maintain pressure on Allied forces and prevent their complete evacuation from the European mainland was crucial for the continuity of the German campaign in France. Following the French campaign, on July 19, 1940, Kesselring was promoted to Generalfeldmarschall. Immediately after the invasion of France, the Battle of Britain would begin, in which Kesselring's Luftflotte 2 directed bombing operations over England, primarily during the day. A year later, during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, and still in command of Luftflotte 2, Kesselring operated in support of Army Group Center with his fleet of 1,223 aircraft, with which he would achieve air superiority over Soviet skies within weeks. By July 26th, Kesselring had reported the destruction of 165 tanks, 2,136 vehicles, 194 artillery pieces, and 915 aircraft destroyed in 1,574 sorties. Kesselring's air fleet provided support in numerous battles on the Eastern Front, such as Bialystok-Minsk, Smolensk, and the final advance towards Moscow. But overconfidence in victory led to the withdrawal of Kesselring's air fleet to the Mediterranean. During his campaign in North Africa, Kesselring ordered Luftflotte 2 to carry out strategic bombing missions against enemy military and infrastructure targets, as well as close air support to ground forces in combat. Kesselring also oversaw interdiction operations to attack Allied supply lines and communications in the region, including maritime convoys and land routes. During his involvement in the Battle of El Alamein in 1942, the Luftwaffe provided crucial air support to Axis forces. But despite Kesselring's efforts and those of his fleet, the defeat at El Alamein marked a turning point in the campaign in favor of the Allies, leading to the withdrawal of Axis forces in North Africa. During the retreat, Kesselring was involved in planning and executing operations to evacuate troops and equipment from the region. In 1943, with the fall of Mussolini and the advance of the Allies, Kesselring was appointed Supreme Commander of Army Group C in Italy. One of Kesselring's most notable strategies was the implementation of the Gustav Line, a formidable defensive line that stretched across the peninsula from the west coast to the Adriatic. This line hindered the Allied advance northward and provided a solid defense for German forces and their Italian allies. Despite difficult circumstances and being constantly outnumbered, Kesselring managed to maintain the cohesion of his troops and delay the Allied advance for months. His ability to make the most of available resources and his capacity to withstand enemy onslaughts made him a respected leader both among his own forces and his adversaries. He demonstrated all his military capabilities in the Battle of Anzio and Monte Cassino in January 1944, when the Allies landed at Anzio as part of Operation Shingle. Kesselring acted quickly and decisively in recognizing the immediate threat posed by this bold move, mobilizing his forces to confront the invaders. His ability to organize German defenses and launch precise counterattacks thwarted Allied attempts to advance inland Italy. The fierce resistance at Anzio became a prolonged standoff, challenging the tenacity and endurance of both sides. Meanwhile, south of Anzio, Monte Cassino stood as an impregnable fortress dominating the Liri River Valley. The hill was a key bastion in German defenses in Italy. The battle for Monte Cassino was a litmus test for Kesselring and his troops, where skillfully coordinating ground and aerial operations, he defended the position tenaciously, leveraging natural fortifications and mobilizing reinforcements to maintain control of the hill. Although the Führer acknowledged Kesselring's military abilities and battlefield experience, by late 1944 and early 1945, with the stalemate on the Italian front, Hitler began to question Kesselring's effectiveness as a commander. Additionally, Kesselring was not fully aligned with Hitler's strategies and visions for war management. His divergent opinions on strategic and tactical decisions, as well as his more pragmatic and less ideological approach, also contributed to Hitler's dwindling confidence in him. After the war, Kesselring was tried for war crimes and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. He spent several years in prison before being released in 1952 due to health issues. He retired to his home in Germany, where he lived in relative anonymity until his death in 1960. Herman Hoth, the General of Relentless Advance. During the invasion of Poland, with the rank of Generalleutnant in the Wehrmacht, Herman Hoth commanded the 15th Panzer Division, a highly mobile tank division specialized in armored warfare, making this division one of the most effective units in the Polish campaign. A year later, during the invasion of France in 1940, Herman Hoth had reached the rank of General der Panzertruppe and commanded the 16th Corps, formed by the 5th and 7th Panzer Divisions, the latter commanded by Major General Irvin Rommel. His corps played a crucial role in breaking through the French defensive lines and in the subsequent deep penetration into French territory. In 1941, Hoth commanded the 3rd Panzer Group during Operation Barbarossa in the advance eastward through Belarus and towards the Soviet border. His unit was one of the main armored forces that carried out the early stages of the invasion, playing a crucial role in breaking through Soviet lines and exploiting the created gaps. During the initial stages of the operation, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group and Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group proceeded to encircle Minsk as part of the operations of Army Group Center, trapping 300,000 soldiers of the Red Army and capturing or destroying 2,500 tanks. Continuing the advance towards Moscow, Hoth and his troops encountered difficult terrain and fierce Soviet resistance in the battles of Vyazma and Bryansk, which, despite the attrition and casualties during the advance of the 3rd Panzer Group, Hoth's forces managed to seal the Vyazma-Bryansk pockets. With the arrival of the Russian winter, conditions became even more adverse, with relentless cold and lack of supplies taking a toll on German forces. During the summer of 1942, in the context of Operation Blue, Hoth commanded the 4th Panzer Group in the German campaign in southern Soviet Union, specifically in the offensive directed towards the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad. His role was crucial in the attempt to encircle and capture the city, resulting in one of the bloodiest and decisive battles of the war. However, despite some initial successes, the German advance was halted, and the Battle of Stalingrad became a catastrophic defeat for the Third Reich, in which Hoth and his forces were trapped in the Soviet encirclement. Although they managed to break out of the pocket in the final stage of the battle, the campaign resulted in enormous losses, forcing German forces into a strategic retreat in the Eastern Front. This retreat involved a general reorganization of the surviving units of Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. In 1943, Hoth once again took command of the reconstituted 4th Panzer Army with the mission of stopping the 1st Soviet Guards and the 6th Army east of Dnipropetrovsk and pushing them back across the Samara River. This operation would be part of the 3rd Battle of Kharkov, where Hoth's forces began their attack on the city of Kharkov on February 28th, which was recaptured by the Germans on March 15th. The fighting in Kharkov subsequently led to the Battle of Kursk, where the 4th Panzer Army of Hoth was tasked with advancing from the Oral salient southward and cutting the Soviet lines. When Operation Citadel began, Hoth's divisions, reinforced by the 2nd SS Panzer Corps under Paul Hauser, penetrated several Soviet defensive lines before being halted in the Battle of Prokhorovka. This was partly the result of Hoth hesitating to continue advancing, as his flanks were threatened by Soviet counterattacks. Therefore, the German advance was halted, and the battle resulted in a costly strategic defeat. By the fall of the same year, during the Battle of the Dnieper, Hoth continued to command the 4th Panzer Army, but this time in the southern front, where his objective was to defend the Dnieper River and protect the flanks of German units in retreat. However, his efforts were in vain, as German forces were unable to contain the Soviet advance and were forced to retreat westward. Although Hitler considered Hoth one of the best tank commanders of the Wehrmacht, thanks to his achievements during the early stages of the war, after a series of significant defeats, his influence and maneuverability diminished as the German army retreated. Following Germany's defeat, Hoth was captured by Allied forces and spent several years in captivity before being released in 1953. He returned to Germany, where he lived in relative anonymity until his death in 1971. Gotthard Hinrich, the unyielding wall of the Reich. As the conflict erupted in 1939, Hinrich had already risen to the rank of lieutenant general. He commanded the 5th Infantry Division in the early stages of the war, participating in the invasion of Poland in 1939. His ability to lead units in combat soon caught the attention of his superiors, and he was promoted to command the 33rd Army Corps, which he led during the Blitzkrieg in France, successfully breaking through the Maginot Line on June 14, 1940. With Operation Barbarossa at its peak, on January 20, 1942, Hinrich assumed command of the 4th Army, directly facing a counterattack towards Moscow during the battles of Zhev, in which the Red Army sought to reduce the German pressure on Moscow. He held out for 10 weeks, despite his troops being vastly outnumbered. There, he developed one of his most celebrated strategies. When he knew a Soviet attack was imminent, he would withdraw his troops from the front line until the Soviet artillery barrage ended, and then redeploy them, unscathed, to surprise the advancing enemy infantry. In the dark days of spring 1945, as the Allied forces advanced from the west and the Red Army approached from the east, at the desperate request of Hines Garian before Hitler, he was given command of the Army Group Vistula, tasked with defending Berlin. Hinrich oversaw the preparation of defences and the execution of the German defence during the Battle of Seelau, which took place in the Oder River region, about 70 kilometers east of Berlin. Faced with the unstoppable advance of the Red Army towards the Reich capital, Hinrich understood the strategic importance of the defensive line at Seelau, which protected direct access to Berlin from the east. Aware of the limitations of resources and personnel, Hinrich implemented a meticulous defensive strategy, making the most of the natural and man-made fortifications built by the Germans in the region. Hinrich managed to gather the remnants of the Army Group Vistula and briefly held off the Soviet offensive in the Battle of the Oder-Neisse, seeking to delay the Soviet advance not only to allow for the evacuation of civilians and preservation of resources, but also to provide time for German troops to regroup and establish new defensive lines in the Seelau Heights. Hinrich hoped that these new defenses would be stronger and harder to penetrate, temporarily halting the Soviet advance. Although the German resistance at Oder-Neisse was tenacious and fierce, the overwhelming superiority of the Red Army ultimately prevailed. However, Hinrich's strategy managed to delay the Soviet advance and inflict considerable casualties, contributing to the preservation of German lives and military resources. After delaying the enemy forces for as long as possible, he ordered his forces to retreat, judging it unfeasible to continue resisting almost without aviation or artillery, and at a disadvantage of 3-1. This withdrawal by Heinrich later incurred Hitler's wrath. In the defensive positions at Seelow, trenches, minefields, barbed wire and anti-tank fortifications were included. Civilians were also evacuated from the area to avoid unnecessary casualties and facilitate troop mobility. During the battle, Heinrich demonstrated his ability to coordinate defense in a difficult and challenging terrain. But despite the determined resistance of German troops, the Soviet forces, under Marshal Georgy Zhukov's command, launched massive and ferocious attacks, supported by intense artillery bombardment. Although Heinrich's troops fought with determination and courage, the Battle of the Seelow Heights resulted in a decisive victory for the Red Army. The German defensive lines were breached, and Soviet forces advanced towards Berlin. After the defense at Seelow was overrun by Soviet forces, Heinrich, opposed to assembling more troops from the west for a desperate battle for Berlin, ordered a withdrawal to the north of the German capital. Recognizing the gravity of the situation and the inevitable fall of Berlin, he decided to preserve the remaining German forces instead of engaging in stubborn defense in the capital. Upon learning of this, he was relieved by Hitler on April 28, 1945, being removed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel after a fierce argument near Neubrandenburg, although he was not sanctioned. Pressured by Keitel to execute the cowards and deserters, Heinrich mockingly challenged Keitel to execute the wounded and sick soldiers who formed the bulk of his troops and continued marching north of Berlin. Although the Führer admired Heinrich's tactical ability and leadership in combat units, known for his focus on flexible defense and his ability to make effective use of limited resources, he expressed frustration with him, especially when his defensive tactics clashed with Hitler's aggressive attack strategy. After the war, Heinrich was arrested and spent several years in captivity before being released in 1948. He returned to Germany, where he lived in relative anonymity until his death in 1971. Heinz Guderian, the Panzer genius in the Blitzkrieg. During the invasion of Poland in September 1939, Heinz Guderian held the rank of General Major and commanded the 2nd Panzer Division of the German Army, which spearheaded an unprecedented offensive. Throughout the German offensive, Guderian distinguished himself through his innovative use of armored forces. In a steel ballet, his tanks swiftly and decisively advanced, overcoming Polish defenses with surgical precision. As one of the main proponents of Blitzkrieg, Guderian demonstrated the effectiveness of such a strategy. Amidst the chaos of the battlefield, Guderian displayed significant tactical flexibility, masterfully coordinating armored operations with infantry and artillery. Thanks to his performance in the Polish campaign, he was promoted to the rank of General der Panzertruppe, General of Armored Troops, in 1940, just before the invasion of France. By the dawn of May 10, 1940, on the battlefields of Western Europe, the war machine of Nazi Germany surged against France and its allies. Guderian's corps led the attack through the Ardennes and across the Meuse River. His panzer group spearheaded the so-called Race to the Sea, culminating in the trapping of the British Expeditionary Force and French forces at Dunkirk. Guderian's rapid penetration into France undermined Allied defensive lines, creating a key strategic breakthrough that contributed to France's swift defeat in a matter of weeks. On June 22, 1941, Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group began its offensive, crossing the Bug River and advancing towards the Dnieper. The combined forces of the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Groups closed the Minsk pocket, capturing 300,000 prisoners before advancing towards Smolensk. By July 10, 1941, German forces launched a massive assault on Soviet defenses around the strategically located city of Smolensk, a crucial point on the route to Moscow. From the outset, Guderian and his troops applied blitzkrieg tactics with deadly precision, using speed and surprise to breach enemy lines. However, the Battle of Smolensk was not an easy victory for the Germans, as it turned into a protracted and bloody engagement with intense urban and field combat. Nonetheless, after weeks of fierce fighting, German forces managed to capture the city in September 1941, bringing them just 320 kilometers from Moscow. By the time German forces approached Moscow, Guderian had been promoted to the rank of Generaloberst, Colonel General, and appointed commander of Army Group Center. Although he retained a significant role in directing armored forces, His primary focus at this point was coordinating and directing operations of all units under his command on the Central Front. During the battle, Guderian faced significant challenges. As German forces neared the Soviet capital, they encountered increasingly fierce resistance from the Red Army and adverse Russian winter conditions, requiring Guderian to deal with coordinating multiple units and planning operations in an increasingly hostile environment. Despite the challenges, Guderian and his forces made considerable advances towards Moscow in the initial stages of the battle. However, as the winter intensified and Soviet resistance strengthened, German forces were forced to halt their advance and adopt a defensive posture. After the Battle of Moscow, Guderian was relieved of command of Army Group Center and transferred to the Southern Eastern Front, where he played a role in planning and executing the German offensive in Ukraine and the Caucasus in the summer and autumn of 1942. By the summer of that year, Guderian commanded the 2nd Panzer Army in Operation Blue, aimed at capturing vital oil resources in the Caucasus and advancing towards the Volga River. However, after the debacle at Stalingrad, Guderian was moved to other fronts and did not have a direct role in the most significant battles until the Battle of Kursk in 1943, where he served as Inspector General of Armored and Motorized Forces. During this period, his views on waging war and his disagreements with Hitler and other German leaders intensified, eventually leading to his removal from operational command positions and assignment to administrative roles. His final combat on the Eastern Front involved overseeing the defense of the fortress of Mariupol in Ukraine. Initially, Hitler viewed Guderian as a military innovator and supported his tactical ideas, which resulted in significant victories for Germany, such as the campaigns in Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. However, despite this, the Führer often distrusted the advice of his generals and preferred to make military decisions himself, leading to an ambivalent relationship with Guderian as the war progressed. After the war, Guderian was captured by Allied forces and spent several years in captivity. He retired from public life and dedicated himself to writing his memoirs and teaching military strategy. Gerd von Rundstedt, the last Prussian of the Reich. During the invasion of Poland in September 1939, Gerd von Rundstedt held the rank of Generaloberst. At that time, he commanded Army Group South, a high-ranking position granting him authority over German forces deployed in southern Poland during the campaign. His army group mainly consisted of the 8th German Army and part of the 10th Army, and its primary objective was to advance from the German border eastward and southeastward into Poland to capture territory and defeat Polish forces. He employed the blitzkrieg tactic, which combined coordinated use of ground, air and armored forces, and swiftly advanced through Polish territory, disrupting enemy defenses. Additionally, Rundstedt oversaw coordination between his army group and other German units on the Polish front, facilitating an efficient and effective military campaign. His leadership during the invasion of Poland earned him recognition within the German High Command and laid the groundwork for his subsequent promotion to Field Marshal in 1940. During the invasion of France in 1940, as commander of Army Group A, his main objective was to advance through Belgium and northeastern France to encircle and outflank Allied defences on the Maginot Line and the Meuse River. This strategy was part of a broader approach to break through enemy lines and rapidly advance into France. Rundstedt supervised the deployment and coordination of various German divisions in his sector, including infantry, armoured and support units. These forces worked closely with the armoured units of Guderian and Manstein, which operated on the left flank of the German advance through the Ardennes. After the successful campaign in France, Rundstedt continued to serve on the Western Front as Commander-in-Chief of German Army Group A, overseeing the occupation of France and subsequently the defense against potential Allied landings. During this time, he was involved in planning and constructing the Atlantic coastal defenses, also known as the Atlantic Wall, in preparation for an eventual Allied attack. In 1942, Rundstedt was transferred to the Eastern Front to assume command of Army Group South, where he supervised German operations in southern Soviet Union. However, due to disagreements with Hitler and strategic differences, he was relieved of command in December 1941, though he was later reinstated in April 1942. After his brief service on the Eastern Front, Rundstedt returned to the Western Front in 1942 to assume command of Army Group West, where he oversaw the defense of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands against potential Allied landings. In 1944, with the Allied landings in Normandy, Rundstedt urged Hitler to negotiate peace with the Allies, but Hitler responded by replacing him once again. On September 1, 1944, he was appointed Western Commander-in-Chief and quickly regrouped troops to oppose Operation Market Garden. During this brief period, Rundstedt oversaw the mobilization of German forces in the Netherlands and coordinated countermeasures to deal with the Allied advance. Despite initial surprise by the Allies and some tactical successes, German forces under Rundstedt's command managed to thwart the main objective of the operation, which was to open a corridor into Germany. 3 months later, during the last major German offensive in the Ardennes, Rundstedt played a key role in planning and coordinating the offensive, although he faced certain objections from other German military leaders, including Adolf Hitler himself, who initially doubted the viability of the operation. Although the German offensive initially achieved significant advances and caught the Allies by surprise, Allied resistance and harsh weather conditions eventually halted the German advance. Thanks to his extensive battlefield experience and reputation as a competent strategist, the Marshal gained Hitler's respect. Rundstedt advocated for a more conservative and realistic strategy, prioritizing the preservation of German forces and avoiding risky maneuvers. On the other hand, Hitler often favored more aggressive and offensive strategies, even when circumstances were not favorable. These strategic differences manifested at various points during the war, primarily during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. After Germany's defeat in 1945, von Rundstedt was captured by Allied forces and spent several years in captivity. He retired from public life and lived in relative anonymity until his death in 1953. Irvin Rommel, the Desert Fox. With the rank of General Major in the Wehrmacht, on February 15, 1940, months after the German victory in Poland, Irvin Rommel took command of the 7th Panzer Division in Bad Godesberg. It was the first time he commanded an armoured unit, so he immediately got to work and spent the following months intensively training with his new unit, getting to know his officers, and preparing everyone for the type of warfare he intended to execute. During the invasion of France in 1940, Irvin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division became an unstoppable force. His presence signalled danger to French defences, which would soon face the fury of the German blitzkrieg. Rommel directed operations from his mobile command post, and as German tanks burst into French territory, Rommel was everywhere at once. Mounted on his own tank, he led the advance with courage and determination. In Arras, he carried out a surprise and bold attack against British defences, paving the way to victory. And in Dunkirk, his division played a crucial role in capturing thousands of Allied soldiers, thus sealing the fate of the campaign in France. In February 1941, the situation in North Africa was grim for Axis forces. Italian troops had suffered setbacks and retreated to Libya. In this challenging scenario, and as commander of the Africa Corps, Rommel was called upon to lead the offensive. After his arrival in Africa, Rommel immediately launched a successful counter-offensive in the Battle of Baie d'Arfom against British forces that had advanced deep into Libya. Throughout a series of campaigns, Rommel faced British forces in a ruthless struggle for control of the desert. But the Battle of Gazala was the culmination of Rommel's career in North Africa, where he deployed bold tactics to surround and dismantle British defences. He used the terrain's topography to his advantage, exploiting dunes and mountains to conceal his movements and surprise his opponents. The Desert Fox managed to create a false attack line in the south, while directing the bulk of his forces to the north to encircle enemy positions, creating chaos in the lines and facilitating the breakthrough of British defences. Following his notable successes in North Africa, Rommel earned Hitler's respect, who began to consider him one of his most capable generals. On June 22, 1942, Erwin Rommel was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal, becoming one of the youngest field marshals in German military history. After his victory at Gazala, in July 1942, the Africa Corps launched a bold attempt to break through the British lines and advanced towards El Alamein and Alexandria. However, Rommel's forces, exhausted by the desert campaign and facing logistical problems, encountered fierce British resistance that halted them in their tracks. But the story wouldn't end there. In the Second Battle of El Alamein, Rommel found himself again facing British forces, and with his characteristic determination, he led the Afrika Korps in a desperate attempt to stop the British advance to the west. However, this time the British forces were better prepared and equipped, and launched an offensive that ultimately forced Rommel to retreat. After the defeat, Rommel's forces limited themselves to ambushing the British army pursuing them, and did not engage in open combat until they reached Tunisia. However, in one of his last battles in Africa, Rommel dealt a heavy blow to American forces in the Battle of Kesselring Pass. On March 6, 1943, Rommel launched his last offensive in North Africa when he attacked the British Eighth Army in the Battle of Medellin. But after losing 52 tanks, Rommel suspended the assault, and on March 9th, he returned to Germany to become the Inspector General of the Atlantic Wall. Facing an imminent Allied invasion in France, his warnings about the need to reinforce defences in Normandy and the need for a swift counterattack after the Allied landing were not heeded by the German High Command. During D-Day, Rommel was in Germany and could not immediately respond to the crisis in Normandy. After the Allied landing in Normandy in June 1944, the relationship between Rommel and Hitler became more tense. Concerned about the growing military crisis and Germany's inability to resist the Allies, Rommel openly expressed skepticism about the possibility of a Nazi victory. But following the assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, known as Operation Valkyrie, the Führer ordered a massive hunt for conspirators, in which Rommel would be implicated due to his connection with the conspirators. Therefore, on October 14, 1944, he was offered the option to commit suicide by taking poison to avoid a public trial and possible reprisals against his family, or face the consequences of his involvement in the assassination attempt. He chose the first option and took poison under the supervision of 2 Nazi officers present at his home in Herlingen, Germany. His death was officially announced as a result of injuries sustained in an Allied air raid. Walter Model, the Lion of Defense. During the invasion of Poland in 1939, with the rank of General Major, Walter Model led the 3rd Panzer Division, demonstrating his ability to coordinate lightning attacks and bold maneuvers. His tactical prowess led to his promotion and assignment to command the 9th Panzer Division during the invasion of France in 1940, where he once again showcased his tactical skill by coordinating rapid attacks and bold maneuvers that contributed to the success of the German Blitzkrieg. His division was one of the most advanced units of the German army, playing a crucial role in penetrating and breaking through French lines. The speed and audacity of the maneuvers of the 3rd Panzer Division under Modell's command surprised the French and Allied forces, significantly contributing to the rapid fall of France in June 1940. His outstanding performance in this pivotal battle further solidified his reputation as one of the Third Reich's most capable and promising commanders. Following Operation Barbarossa in 1941, launched by the Wehrmacht, and the defeat in Stalingrad, which marked the beginning of Operation Uranus in 1942 by the Red Army on the Eastern Front, Soviet counter-offensives put pressure on the German army in numerous battles. Faced with this situation, Hitler turned to Walter Model as a key figure to counter the crises emerging on fronts teetering on the brink of collapse. Thus, Model acquired the nickname Hitler's Firefighter. During Operation Bagration, launched by the Soviet Red Army on June 22, 1944, Walter Model held the position of commander of the German Army Group Center on the Eastern Front and was responsible for directing German defenses against the Soviet advance. Model attempted to organize orderly resistance and launch counterattacks to halt the Soviet advance. He demonstrated his ability to make tactical decisions in extremely difficult conditions and to maintain the morale of his troops in a moment of crisis, showcasing his skill as a military leader. Despite the ultimate defeat in Operation Bagration, Model's effort to resist the Soviet advance and to maintain the cohesion of the German forces reflected his commitment as a commander and his determination to fight to the end. Shortly thereafter, On December 16, 1944, the German army launched one of its last offensives in the Ardennes, with the main objective of breaking through Allied lines, seizing the port of Antwerp, and dividing the American and British forces. With the rank of General Feldmarschall, Field Marshal, and as commander of Army Group B, Model was responsible for leading German forces in the offensive. Using a strategy of surprise attack through the dense forests of the Ardennes, Model aimed to exploit perceived weaknesses in the Allied lines and cause a significant breakthrough. During the offensive, the Marshal demonstrated his tactical ability by keeping the preparations for the offensive secret and by coordinating the movement of German forces through the difficult terrain of the Ardennes. Despite logistical difficulties and adverse weather hindering German efforts, Model persisted in his attempt to advance westward. Although the German offensive did not achieve its long-term strategic objectives and resulted in defeat, Model demonstrated exceptional leadership by maintaining the morale of his men and leading from the front despite the challenges. Despite Hitler's confidence in Model and considering him one of his most capable generals, the operation's failure caused Model a depression from which he never recovered and marked the end of the special relationship Model had with Hitler. He requested permission to withdraw to the Rhine River, but Hitler denied it and restricted the operations of his army group with only one order: to defend the terrain to the last man. On April 1, 1945, the Army Group B, led by Model, found itself in a desperate situation in the Ruhr region of Germany, which would become known as the Ruhr Pocket, initiating a fierce battle where the pocket itself was split in two on April 14th. Hitler ordered the pocket to become a fortress and the factories to be destroyed, but Model disobeyed the order and ordered the dissolution of the divisions under his command and for his men to surrender. On April 21, 1945, on the outskirts of his last headquarters in Duisburg, Walter Model handed over a letter, his wedding ring, and some personal effects to a trusted officer to be sent to his family. He then went to a nearby forest and shot himself in the head, later being buried at the site of his death. Erich von Manstein, the supreme master of military strategy. In the early days of the conflict, von Manstein held the rank of lieutenant general and commanded the 56th Infantry Division, showcasing his tactical prowess and his ability to coordinate troop movements on the battlefield. During the Battle of France in 1940, as Chief of Staff of Army Group A, Erich von Manstein developed and implemented the strategy known as the Manstein Plan, or Sickle Cut Plan. The plan involved diverting the attention of the Allied forces to the north, making it appear that the main German effort would be directed through Belgium, while the true main attack would be launched through the Ardennes, breaking through the French and British defensive lines and flanking them from the south. After the successful invasion of France in 1940, he was promoted to the rank of General der Panzertruppe, General of Armored Troops. This promotion reflected his prominent role and his ability in the use of armored units during the campaign. A year later, during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, he commanded the LVI Panzer Corps during the initial phase of the German invasion of the Soviet Union and was responsible for directing the German armored forces in the advance towards Ukraine and Crimea. One of von Manstein's most significant achievements during the initial phase of the invasion was his role in the capture of the important port and naval base of the city of Sevastopol in the Crimean Peninsula. After German troops assaulted the Soviet defenses and surrounded the city, von Manstein implemented innovative tactics to reduce and eventually capture Sevastopol in July 1942. In December 1942, amidst the harsh Russian winter, von Manstein devised a bold plan, Operation Winter Storm, known in German as Wintergewitter. With limited forces and facing fierce resistance, von Manstein led a desperate surge to break through the Soviet lines and open a corridor to Stalingrad, hoping to save the now besieged Sixth Army. Despite achieving initial advances, the inhospitable terrain and fierce Soviet opposition thwarted German efforts. However, von Manstein's tenacity and leadership amidst the chaos of battle highlighted his ability as a consummate strategist. For his participation, he was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal in March 1943. During the offensives in February 1943, the Red Army broke through the German defensive lines and recaptured Kursk on the 9th. Faced with the danger of encirclement of Army Groups B and Don, Manstein requested reinforcements. By mid-month, frustrated, Manstein asked Hitler to appoint him commander of the entire Eastern Front. Faced with this request and the difficult situation of his troops, Hitler flew to the front in person on February 17th. In 3 days of meetings, Manstein convinced Hitler of the need for offensive action to regain the initiative and avoid encirclement. Troops were reorganized and reinforcements were introduced. The counter-offensive, launched on February 20th, known as Manstein's Mobile Defense, took the Soviet forces by surprise. By March 2nd, the Wehrmacht had captured 615 tanks and killed about 23,000 Soviet soldiers. Manstein gathered his forces along a wide front to prevent encirclement, and they recaptured Kharkov on March 14th after intense fighting. The counter-offensive not only prevented the disintegration of the front, but also regained substantial territory and destroyed Soviet forces, ending with the thaw season on March 23rd. In the summer of 1943, in the vast fields of the Kursk region in the Soviet Union, and as commander of Army Group south of the German Army, von Manstein had a prominent role during Operation Citadel. During the battle, he demonstrated remarkable ability to adapt to the changing circumstances of the battlefield. Despite challenges and Soviet counterattacks, he remained calm and adjusted his tactics as necessary. Although the German offensive at Kursk did not achieve its strategic objectives, von Manstein stood out for his inspiring leadership, his ability to maintain the morale of his troops amidst chaos, and his tactical approach focused on operational flexibility and effective use of armored forces. Regarding von Manstein's relationship with the Führer, it was complex. Initially, Hitler had great confidence in von Manstein and valued his tactical abilities, and von Manstein, for his part, admired Hitler's determination and strategic vision. The relationship of mutual trust was reinforced by the general's initial successes in the Battle of France and other campaigns. However, as the war progressed, tensions arose between von Manstein and Hitler due to strategic differences and disputes over the direction of the war. Von Manstein often expressed criticisms and concerns about Hitler's decisions, especially regarding the planning of military operations on the Eastern Front. Throughout the war, the relationship between von Manstein and Hitler oscillated between strategic cooperation and tactical disagreements, but both recognized each other's skill and valor on the battlefield. In the final months of the war, von Manstein was appointed commander of Army Group Vistula, a crucial position in Germany's defense against the relentless advance of the Red Army. Despite being outnumbered and out-resourced, von Manstein once again demonstrated his ability to maintain cohesion and discipline within the German ranks. However, German forces on the Eastern Front were ultimately overwhelmed by the advance of the Red Army, and Army Group South was forced to retreat westward. Von Manstein was relieved of his command in March 1944 due to strategic differences with Hitler. Erich von Manstein surrendered to British forces on May 23, 1945, and was captured in northern Germany. After the war, von Manstein was tried for war crimes and sentenced to 18 years in prison. However, his sentence was reduced, and he spent only a few years in captivity before being released. In his later years, von Manstein wrote his memoirs and retired to private life, reflecting on his role in one of history's most devastating conflicts. When analyzing the contributions of the leading German generals during World War II, the figure of Erich von Manstein stands out as a true military luminary. His tactical and strategic brilliance was evident in numerous crucial battles, where he demonstrated exceptional ability to read the battlefield and exploit the enemy's weaknesses. Von Manstein excelled in his ability to quickly adapt to changing situations, allowing him to maintain an advantage over his opponents, even in moments of crisis. His audacity in planning operations and his ability to execute surprise maneuvers earned him a series of significant victories for Germany, such as in the campaign in France in 1940, the Battle of Kharkov in 1943, and the counteroffensive in Crimea in 1944. In addition to his tactical prowess, von Manstein was a charismatic leader who inspired confidence and loyalty in his troops. His ability to motivate his men and keep their morale high was crucial to the success of many of his military operations. He is often recognized for his pragmatic approach and his ability to work within the limitations imposed by the German High Command. Although his relationship with the Nazi regime was complex and often contentious, von Manstein was distinguished by his independence of thought and his willingness to challenge orders he deemed incorrect or unrealistic. This integrity and courage earned him the respect of both his soldiers and other generals.